One's been branded a member of the axis of evil, the other, the great Satan. They've been trading insults for years. But now Iran and the United States are sitting down and talking. What about? What does it mean? This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm David Foster. It's their first real public diplomacy in almost 3 decades. The United States and Iran face to face across a table. On the official agenda, a pressing common interest: how to achieve stability in Iraq. Washington says it wants Tehran to stop backing militants. Tehran wants the U.S. out of Iraq. But much more is at stake. The standoff over Iran's nuclear program, for one thing, and the state's very obvious military build-up in the Gulf raises the spectre of Iran under attack. So what can these talks achieve? Well, after the meeting, Ryan Crocker, the U.S. ambassador to Iraq, said he had laid out his country's demands to the Iranian government.
Their aims and goals, in terms very similar to our own policy, and very similar to what the Iraqi government has set as its own a set of guiding principles. So from that point of view, I would say that the talks proceeded positively. What we underscored to the Iranians, though, is that beyond principle there is practice, and what we need to see is Iranian actions on the ground come into harmony with their stated principles, because right now the actions that I described to them and that I just described to you are running at cross purposes to their own policy. So in terms of what happens next, I think we're going to want to wait and see.
Talks were held against the backdrop of a number of accusations traded between the two countries. Iran accusing the United States of sponsoring what it calls subversives and operating a spy network to carry out sabotage in sensitive border areas, of holding 7 Iranians who the U.S. says are members of Iran's Revolutionary Guard, Tehran insisting that they're diplomats. Iran also considers the U.S.-led occupation force in Iraq a major cause of problems in the region. Well, for its part, the Bush administration accuses Iran and its Revolutionary Guard of supplying armed groups inside Iraq with armor-piercing roadside bombs that have been blamed for the deaths of many U.S. soldiers, and of fomenting violence through its support of political extremist groups. In the State of the Union address in 2002, Mr. Bush outlined a U.S. position on Iran which has changed little in 5 years.
Iran aggressively pursues these weapons and exports terror, while an unelected few repress the Iranian people's hope for freedom. States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world. By seeking weapons of mass destruction, these regimes pose a grave and growing danger.
And on Thursday, the Iranian president defied U.S.-led pressure on his country, which is centered around criticism of Iran's nuclear program.
Today, the Iranian nation has industrial nuclear technology. The path is light and clear, and in this path, our nation will not withdraw even one step.
Joining us now, our guests from Dubai, Michael Peltier, the U.S. State Department Director for Regional Media Affairs. From London, Professor Abbas Edelat of Imperial College London and founder of the Campaign Against Sanctions and Military Intervention in Iran. And in Doha, Amar Hamzawi, Senior Associate at the Carnegie Endowment in Washington. Amar Hamzawi, if I could start with you first of all. We've seen the pictures of the two sides at the table. That's quite extraordinary given the history and friction between Iran and the United States. But what are we seeing now? Are we seeing something that is principally to do with Iraq or the start of something new?
We are seeing a bilateral track between the U.S. and the Islamic Republic and Iran being finally started. What we did see over the last few weeks was different meetings, 2 regional meetings in which both the American and the Iranian sides participated. This is finally a step forward with regard to bilateral negotiations, and it is focused on Iraq. But as we all know, to start a negotiating track, a bilateral negotiating track, will definitely take the two parties into addressing other issues, not right away gradually. It is a process which the two sides have started today, focused on Iraq as of now, but it will definitely move beyond Iraq to address the regional role of Iran, the security of the Islamic Republic in Iran, as well as the file of nuclear technology and Iran's defiance with regard to United Nations resolutions.
Okay, Michael Peltier from the U.S. State Department. Let me read you something that the Iranian foreign minister said after the meeting. Munachir Mataki saying that for these talks to work, for them to go a stage further, the United States must admit that its Middle East policy has failed. You're not going to do that, are you?
Well, I think that what's important is that you did have these meetings in Baghdad under the hosting of the government of Iraq, and looking at the way forward towards reestablishing security and stability in Iraq, and which everybody now realizes and says publicly is in everyone in the region's interest, particularly in the Iraqi people's interest. How that then moves forward is a question of realities on the ground and acts on the ground. I think, as Ambassador Crocker said in the clip that you played earlier, you know, the Iranian government's position is clear. Unfortunately, the facts on the ground don't back it up, and we hope that those facts on the ground will in fact back it up.
Okay, but I use the quote from the Iranian foreign minister simply to illustrate how big a gap there is between you.
Well, in some senses there's a gap. In other senses, I think what you saw today was that everybody agreed that, you know, supporting the Maliki government, supporting a return of security and stability in Iraq is in everyone's interest. The Iranians said so, the Americans said so, and all the neighboring countries have said so in Sharm el-Sheikh recently at the Neighbors Conference. So I think that is what's important. And now what we need to do is see how to best move forward with, as I said, changes in behavior on the ground, in realities.
Professor Adalat from the Campaign Against Sanctions and Military Intervention in our London studio at the moment. I quoted your foreign minister saying America's got to admit that its policy in the Middle East has failed. Well, you've got about as much chance of getting the US to say that as we have of Tehran admitting that its nuclear program up till now has been nothing more than a joke.
Well, the major issue here, I think, is whether this set of negotiations is going to be taking place in good faith on both sides. That's the major issue. See, is it really a genuine interest on the part of the US administration to enter into dialogue with Iran and remove its threat for a regime change in Iran, remove the threat of using military force against Iranian nuclear plants to overthrow the regime and so on, or not? You see, the Iranian government, there is compelling evidence that is participating in these negotiations in good faith. Muqtada Assad, after an absence of a few months from the public domain, said in his Friday prayers in Basra that there should be no attacks on the coalition forces, and that the Mahdi army should seek politically to get rid of the US occupation in Iraq. So I think that was under the influence of the Iranian regime. But on the other hand, the US has had now a total of 9 warships entering the Persian Gulf. It has accused very recently Iran of having links with Al-Qaeda. It's totally unfounded and unsubstantiated allegations, which are highly incriminating against Iran, and has refused to release the 5 Iranian diplomats which it arrested by raiding the Erbil consulate in Iraq back in January. So the US does not seem to be participating in these negotiations in good faith. And there is a suspicion that the US is only trying to saturate all this sort of the diplomatic courses as far as the pressure of the international community is concerned, to finally justify more pressure, more sanctions on Iran, and finally justify a military intervention against Iran, blaming Iran for the benchmarks for establishing security in Iraq, which are failing.
Okay,
So
but what we're
that's
trying
the
to do
major
here is
issue.
we're trying to see if there is a way forward from the present position. So let me bring back in Amar Hamzawi to talk about the bigger picture. The United States has relied a lot on intelligence, which it says proves that Iran has been supplying weapons to insurgents, to people fighting in Iraq. And yet today we hear from the independent think tank in London called BASIC, which says few independent analysts now believe Tehran's playing a decisive role in sectarian warfare and insurgency. When it says few people believe that now, who's it referring to?
Well, I guess they are referring to two facts. One, Iran, especially over the last 2 years, has been trying to position itself in Iraq in a way that really reaches out not only to Shia groups but only to Sunni groups. Iran has been close to both of them. Of course, there are different political weights on the ground in Iraq. Shia forces seem to be more central to the Iraqi political process as compared to Sunni, but Iran has been reaching out to both of them. Two, I guess it is in Iran's interest to stabilize Iraq. I mean, to an extent, the conceptualization of the Iranian role in Iraq as ultimately trying to maximize the momentum of instability to gain benefits is wrong. Iran has a substantial interest in stabilizing Iraq, but the real question is, we do have two trajectories on the ground. One is a negotiating momentum, as we have seen today, and the second trajectory, which is based on a radicalization of the rhetoric on both sides, the U.S. administration as well as the Iranians. And then you have tactical confrontations. You have the U.S. capturing and arresting Iranian citizens in Iraq, Iran doing the same with dual nationals, American citizens, and accusing them of forming a network of spies. So we have a radicalization of the rhetoric and the negotiating momentum.
Okay, I want to put a point to Michael Peltier from the U.S. State Department about the Iran-Syria Policy and Operations Group established in the United States, which some people felt was plotting covert actions in Iran and Syria and aiming for regime change. It's now been shut down. Some suggestions that this is because you're reining back from a confrontational policy, particularly with Iran. What do you say to that?
I think our policy towards Iran has been very clear and really hasn't changed much from the beginning. In terms of the talks today and the talks in Sharm and earlier at Baghdad, that is a track that is there to deal with, as the professor just said, the interest of everybody in restoring security and stability in Iraq. That is a very specific track, and today's talks, for example, were very focused on that, and that has not changed. In terms of the international community's concerns about Iran's nuclear policy, the P5+1, the permanent 5 members of the UN +1, have had talks and continue to have talks with the Iranian government about the international community's concerns about the Iranian nuclear policy. That has been out there and that has not changed. The international community's willingness to work with the possibility of peaceful civilian nuclear energy for Iran has not changed if Iran meets the international conditions and the international community's concerns about its program.
Okay,
so
gentlemen, for
now,
now,
a lot of those programs out there, our policies are out there, and they really haven't changed.
Plenty more time to talk in just a moment, but we're going to take a short break now. When we come back, we'll take a closer look at the meeting's significance, where it might lead. Stay with us on Insights.